I live in Reno without a car. I made this lifestyle choice years ago because I would rather deal with this town's atrocious bike infrastructure and anemic transit system than deal with the many frustrations that I regularly faced while driving. Even though it is better for me, there are still challenges with getting around. Since the transportation system focuses exclusively on cars, anyone who cannot or does not drive is neglected and left with nothing but the scraps that are left over from after the car infrastructure has been installed. Those who can drive do not escape the consequences of a transportation system that pools everyone into cars either. Have you ever been on the road one day and felt that there were a lot of bad drivers, and you were worried that mayhem could strike at any moment? Even though I don't drive myself, there are still plenty of times where drivers practice bad or unsafe maneuvers. This includes, but is not limited to, running red lights, failing to yield for pedestrians, blocking crosswalks, blocking sidewalks, picking a bad time to advance into the intersection, and parking on a bike gutter that's on a red curb, among plenty of other incidents that I could not catch on camera. I do not want to outright say people who make these mistakes are bad drivers. A big part of the problem is design. The streets, roads, and stroads fail to convey the appropriate driving behavior, resulting in the mess that we routinely see on our roadways. At the same time, there are certain expectations for how a driver should behave when on the road, and oftentimes they fall short of those expectations. It's sort of a too many cooks will spoil the broth kind of situation. When there are a lot of people who all need to take charge and handle transportation on their own, chances are something somewhere along the way will go wrong. There are all sorts of explanations for why someone would make a mistake while driving. Perhaps they are stressed, distracted, or tired, leading to them making mistakes that they normally wouldn't. In addition, some people might not have had enough practice before getting their driver's license, or they were given a license despite not being cut out for driving. Sadly, throughout the United States, a car is practically a requirement for almost any daily activity. Americans do not get a break from driving, so whenever they need to get groceries, go to work, go to school, run errands, etc., their instinct is to get into a car and drive somewhere, even if they probably shouldn't. When infrastructure that forces everyone into cars is coupled with lenient requirements that make it easy to get a driver's license, the road is comprised of various flavors of motorists who make bad or unsafe decisions. The driving conditions then become worse for everyone. Starting with the process of becoming a licensed driver, in the state of Nevada, once a teenager turns 15 and a half years old, they are eligible for a learner's permit. They first have to pass a vision test and a knowledge test. After studying or cramming the driver's handbook and passing the vision and knowledge tests, someone can be granted a learner's permit that allows them to practice driving under supervision. The driving coach can be just about anyone. In Nevada, the coach needs to be at least 21 years old and they need to have their driver's license for over a year. These requirements are so lenient that it's not unusual to just be taught by your parents. Practice may begin at an empty parking lot, expanding onto suburban streets, later into arterial stroads. And after logging 50 hours of behind-the-wheel experience, with at least 10 of those hours taking place after dark, they may be ready to take a skills test. The skills test can be taken as early as 16 years of age. It is worth noting that 16 is far too young to start driving. Studies have shown that teenagers are worse drivers than adults. When looking at crash data, teenagers get into significantly more crashes than adults, especially during the first few months of receiving their license. Fatal crashes are the leading cause of death in female teenagers and one of the leading causes in male teenagers. The reason for these trends are immaturity and inexperience. Teenagers are more likely to speed, make bad maneuvers, and ride with passengers who distract them. Essentially, they are not ready to handle the responsibilities that come with operating a vehicle. The minimum age to begin learning how to drive should be raised, to better reflect the point in someone's life when they are actually ready to drive. There also needs to be more time spent training new drivers, so they can be more prepared for the kinds of situations that they will encounter when on the road. A study conducted by Oregon transportation officials found 91% of teen crashes were caused by people who did not undergo a proper driver's education program. Any schmo with a license is not a particularly good choice for an instructor, and new drivers would be better off if they were taught by a more professional driving coach who is a part of a driver's education program. The entire reason a driver's license and a learner's permit are locked behind several different assessments is to act as a sort of filter that sifts out people who are not ready to drive and people who probably shouldn't be driving. Sadly, if not enough people are sifted, then the roads become comprised of, dare I say, incompetent drivers who are at a substantially greater risk of causing collisions. More rigorous training and more strict licensing requirements would help prevent people who aren't ready to drive from receiving a license. On the other end of the age spectrum is elderly drivers. After a certain age, someone's cognitive ability begins to decline, to the point where people over the age of 75 start getting into substantially more crashes than other younger drivers. Older drivers are a danger mostly to themselves and their passengers who are typically older. If someone is at a point in their life where they shouldn't be driving anymore, and they are putting themselves and others at risk by getting behind the wheel, they should probably have their license taken away from them and be relinquished of their privilege to drive. It may be hard for someone to either be denied a license or lose their license, but that is mainly because owning a car is so integral for daily life. People genuinely believe that having a license is needed to simply traverse the city they live in, and they cannot be a productive member of society if they do not drive. If there were adequate alternatives to driving, then taking away someone's license or preventing them from having one wouldn't be a matter of taking away their independent mobility, whereas preventing them from using a transportation option that is not meant for them. Another reason to have higher standards before handing someone a driver's license is because drivers do not do a good job assessing their own skill. Drivers generally consider themselves to be above average, even if it may not necessarily reflect reality. So you may have drivers who aren't fit to be on the road, but continue to drive anyway because they think they are a good driver. Way back in the 1980s, Ola Svensson of Stockholm University in Sweden published a study that surveyed US and Swedish drivers on their skill in driving and how safe they were as drivers. 88% of drivers in the US group and 77% in the Swedish group believe themselves to be safer than the median driver. Other surveys have concluded the same results. Drivers tend to think highly of their own skill. In 2011, Allstate surveyed 1,000 adults and found nearly 2/3 of them rate themselves as excellent or very good drivers. Interestingly enough, they also seem to think poorly of other drivers. 53% rate drivers from other states as average or poor, while just 8% rate those drivers as excellent or very good. It may seem weird that a lot of people think they are better than average, but there is actually a good explanation for it. If someone goes months or even years without getting into a collision, they are more likely to assume that they are a good driver because they haven't been in an incident that would challenge them on that belief. Essentially, the reason people generally assume they are a better than average driver is because there is no feedback loop when someone makes bad decisions on the road. If a motorist speeds, runs a red light, or fails to yield for a pedestrian, there may be a patrol car who goes after them or a camera that snaps a picture of their license plates, but that's about it. The only conditioning against bad driving behavior is the occasional citation. Drivers are rarely told that they are bad because they blocked the crosswalk, failed to stop for a pedestrian, or parked in the bike lane. There are no updates to the infrastructure either, so motorists continue making the same mistakes despite it being considered bad driving behavior. Stop signs are a fairly infamous example of this. We agree that drivers are intended to stop at stop signs, but that may not be what actually happens. It is not unusual for a driver to approach a stop sign, slow down but not completely stop, and then proceed through the stop sign after seeing that the way is clear. Either way, they did not stop like the sign intended. If a motorist receives a citation for failing to stop, they may be more upset at the fact that they were caught than the fact they didn't completely stop. Without updating the infrastructure to add speed humps and other forms of traffic calming, drivers will continue making the same maneuvers that we agree is bad driving behavior as though it is acceptable. So people can run stop signs and still think that they are a good driver because the infrastructure is doing nothing to reinforce that it is bad to run a stop sign. In addition to not stopping at stop signs, drivers practice plenty of other bad or unsafe maneuvers when on the road. The aforementioned Allstate survey found 89% of drivers admitted to driving faster than the posted speed limit, with 40% saying they've driven more than 20 miles an hour over the limit. 45% admitted to driving while excessively tired, to the point of almost falling asleep. 15% said they drove while intoxicated. More than 1/3 have sent a text message or email while driving. Finally, 56% of drivers say they have been involved in an accident, with 28% of them saying it was their fault. It is genuinely concerning that you can never be sure if the drivers around you are practicing safe driving habits, or if they are even in the right state of mind to be driving. Driving is a fairly stressful activity that requires constant attention to the hectic environments that surround the vehicle. And you only need one negligent or careless driver to put themselves and everyone around them at risk. One person who probably shouldn't have been driving, but had no other viable alternatives to get to wherever they are going, is all it takes to lead to a rather misfortunate situation. Perhaps the most disturbing data here is the number of people who admitted to driving intoxicated and driving tired. Studies have shown that driving tired is about as dangerous as driving drunk. Researchers at Utrecht University in the Netherlands had 14 men aged 21 to 25 drive at night and measured deviations from the center lane. 2 hours of driving at night resulted in the same errors experienced with a blood alcohol content of 0.05%. After 4.5 hours, performance was equivalent to 0.10% blood alcohol content. People who drive fatigued are just as prone to making mistakes as people who drive drunk because they are both too delirious to drive safely. Drunk driving and tired driving are actually caused by the same problems: bad zoning laws and inadequate transit options. Some suburban developments are built so far away from anything of substance that the people living there have absurdly long commutes. We like to call them bedroom communities, which is kind of an admission that is a housing development that is so far away from anything of substance that the only thing you'll really be doing is driving to it and going to sleep. Consequently, if someone isn't well rested, they may be forced to drive tired during their longer commute, as there are no transit options that could be used to take a less mentally strenuous commute. Similarly with drunk driving, people like to drink as a social activity. However, since bars are placed far away from residential neighborhoods, the only option to get to one is to drive there, drink, and then drive home, even if you probably shouldn't. Operating a vehicle requires constant attention to the hectic environments, and you only need one negligent driver to put themselves and those around them at risk. This makes the chaotic nature of freeways, stroads, and busy parking lots all the more stressful to drive on. Unfortunately, since Americans do not have many opportunities to break away from driving, the tension may build, leading to drivers getting increasingly more agitated and making unsafe decisions that they normally wouldn't. Some people are not that great at handling stress, and they may end up taking their frustrations out on others, which leads to road rage. One Forbes study found that more than 1 in 5 drivers have seen someone cause an accident due to road rage, with 23% of drivers knowing someone who has become injured in a road rage incident. The study noted a high percentage of mildly innocuous actions, such as rude gestures or honking in frustrations, along with more dangerous actions, such as tailgating, cutting someone off, making threats, blocking them from changing lanes, and, in some terrifying cases, brandishing a gun and firing it. Some drivers mentioned they expressed road rage because they were already stressed, exhausted, angry, or running late. None of these actions are acceptable driving behavior, and they are partly a product of Americans constantly being exposed to stressful situations when behind the wheel. Having alternatives to driving would allow people to break away from the tense situations that come with driving and to enjoy a more relaxing commute. Something as simple as riding a bike to work can go a long way to improve someone's mental health. In fact, a study published in the International Journal of Workplace Health Management found cycling tends to reduce stress compared to driving a car to work. Since riding a bike is a physical activity, it also comes with a whole slew of additional benefits to mental and physical health. I myself have felt this when I first decided to give up driving and started taking the RTC Regional Connector from Carson City to the University of Nevada, Reno. I immediately felt the burden of transportation be lifted from me, and I no longer had to worry about making sure I had enough gas to get there, finding a place to park, and being able to afford the costs of owning a vehicle. I cannot overstate how nice it is to not have to be the one driving somewhere. A substantial portion of vehicle trips are for distances of 3 miles or less, which is perfectly suitable for a bike ride. With a robust network of protected bike paths, it would be safer and more accessible, thus allowing more people to willingly ride a bike for their commute and reap the benefits of routine physical exercise. Instead of the roads being filled with more people who are annoyed about all the nuisances with driving, they could unwind with a more pleasant commute. Even if a motorist isn't prone to these kinds of issues and is genuinely a good driver, there may still be forces beyond their control, such as inclement weather that is unsafe to drive in, and they would need to be able to take a break from it. I remember one day when riding the bus from Reno to Carson City, it started to snow and the freeway was a bit icy. When the bus got onto the I-580, I saw a bunch of crashes as cars kept sliding into both the concrete barrier and into each other. Some people may look at an incident like this and shrug it off by saying, nobody knows how to drive in the snow. According to a survey from Discount Tire, 91% of American drivers do not trust other drivers to stay safe during the winter, and 23% of the 2,000 people surveyed admitted to having a friend or a family member they avoid riding with during the winter months. There is some truth to suggesting that people forget how to drive when it snows. Adapting to different roadway conditions takes time. When someone is used to driving in dry conditions, they won't immediately understand how having less traction affects their vehicle's movement. They will have to relearn how to control their vehicle during the winter months, leading to a spike in collisions during the winter season. This is why, when it snows, there is a quick response to plow and salt the roadways. At the same time, there should be ways to avoid driving entirely. If someone isn't comfortable driving in the snow due to inexperience or not having a vehicle designed for it, they should be able to take a bike, a bus, a tram, or a train, or some other alternative that makes the drive itself unnecessary. Overall, breaking away from the notion that the car should be the default mode of transportation doesn't only benefit people who don't drive or can't drive. There are plenty of use cases where robust transit services and contiguous bike networks also make city living better for other drivers. In our current transportation system, the roadways are clogged with people who have a substantial reason to drive, people who shouldn't be driving at the time, and people who shouldn't be driving ever. The reason there may seem to be a lot of bad drivers wherever you go is because there are a lot of drivers in general. Oftentimes, the American solution to this problem is to place a sign on the highway with some sort of safety slogan. Sometimes, to be extra fun, the Department of Transportation may have people submit ideas for safety slogans or vote on a safety slogan to be used. I feel the need to bring this up because it is neither productive nor helpful. The sign might as well read, "We've tried nothing and we're all out of ideas." It's frustrating that the solution can never just be having fewer drivers. There is no amount of education and enforcement that will get everyone to drive perfectly, and that's an unreasonable expectation to have anyway. People are going to make mistakes, and the infrastructure needs to mitigate or prevent the consequences of those mistakes. Part of this means having adequate alternatives to driving, so people don't feel the need to drive whenever they leave their home. If safer streets are truly desired, the car cannot be the default method of transportation. There should be dense walkable communities that provide basic amenities within a 15-minute walk of home. There should be frequent trams and trains so people can traverse larger distances without a car. There should be bike infrastructure that makes the city feel more interconnected when not driving a vehicle. Striking a balance between walkable communities, bike infrastructure, and transit services would reduce the number of vehicle miles traveled. With fewer people driving, that would also mean fewer inexperienced drivers, tired drivers, stressed drivers, immature drivers, intoxicated drivers, elderly drivers, overconfident drivers, distracted drivers, and of course, bad drivers. In a genuinely helpful transportation system, not only would nobody have to drive, but they might not even want to. We could all have more pleasant trips to wherever we are going if the car wasn't the only way to get around.